christiangeekcentral.com. The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free.
Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Right now I'm going to attempt to examine the Bible and dissect some of the churchy language we can very easily take for granted, digging into history and languages as I'm able anyway, to try and get at the heart of the text so that we can hopefully see and then apply at least some of what God has for us in these words today. Now, I'm not formally trained in Scripture. I'm just a guy using resources and a questioning mind to try and get at the truth, and that's something that we can all do, so I hope that you will be doing that with me. Excuse me. We are in the book of Philippians, and we've arrived now at chapter 4, verse 8, which has been a very important verse for me personally for a number of years now, and we're really taking our time with this verse because there's a lot packed into it. So this is part 2 of our look at Philippians 4:8, and again in the ESV that reads, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." We've been intentionally taking our time to consider each of the key words in this verse, and there are many of them. And each of these words we're meant to think about. It says, think about these things. So we're slowing down and we're looking at just a couple at a time so that we can gain as much as possible from this rich verse about managing and developing our thought lives as Christians. This time we're going to look at the words just and pure, and I'll make some observations about the benefits of contemplating these ideas deeply. However, I'm just scratching the surface here, guys. I'm sure that you could think of more benefits of thinking about each of these things, and so I would love to hear what comes to your mind. But here we go. Whatever is just, think about these things. The Greek word for just here is also translated as right or righteous. In fact, I think that's how the ESV usually translates it elsewhere. It refers to that which conforms to God's standards and is accepted or approved by Him. It's very often our tendency, certainly mine, to mentally compare our morality to others or to emphasize a moral standard in our minds that we kind of conveniently feel like we're able to meet most of the time. But spending regular time thinking about God's standards, that which is just, strips away our self-serving categorizations and exposes how far we continually fall short and are in need of forgiveness. Now, this would be an endlessly discouraging mental exercise if it weren't for the complete and tireless forgiveness that Jesus gives us. In that context, considering God's standards actually becomes freeing. It becomes like this exciting revelation of where we can be moving next. You know, when we emphasize a standard that we think we can meet, our sense of well-being and self-worth will be chained to the need we feel to meet that standard constantly. Life that way is an exhausting quest to keep up appearances, or if not keep up appearances for the sake of others, at least mentally justify ourselves so that we feel good about ourselves. But relying on Christ's righteousness placed on our record, we can face our shortcomings fearlessly because they have no bearing on our worth or acceptance by God. We get the contentment and satisfaction of arriving at righteousness before God. We can actually feel that if we are thinking about this rightly and truly, imprinting on our minds that I have been given the righteous record of Christ. When God looks at me, He sees a righteous person because of what Christ has done. And so if we can arrive at that place mentally, we can really experience the satisfaction that we're meant to feel of arriving at this state of righteousness before God. And yet we're still then able to be engaging in the purpose and fulfillment that's found in the journey of becoming more like Jesus increasingly over time. So in that forgiven, already but not yet state of righteousness, we can freely contemplate God's standards, look unflinchingly at where we are at, and without discouragement ask, okay, what's the next step I can take toward God's standard? And enjoy the fulfillment that comes from realizing, wow, I am moving toward being more like Christ. Okay, so the second word, pure. Whatever is pure, think about these things. The Greek word for pure here can refer to chastity when used in its narrow sense. It doesn't seem to be its narrow sense that's in mind here. It more broadly refers to cleanliness without fault. It seems really fitting to me that this word would come right after the word referring to God's standards. When we consider what God's standards are, it's not something that we are to do selectively, although we can easily find ourselves just kind of thinking about God's standards selectively. But rather, we're to think of His standards with pervasive consistency in every area of life, without neglecting any detail. So we're to consider what true purity is, without any flaws, anything else in the mix, but absolutely pure goodness. This is a call here, I think, to think about and apply more thoroughly God's standards when it is otherwise so easy for us to allow sin in the mix with otherwise good things. Let me give you some examples. What does completely pure and untainted love look like when there are no conditions or prerequisites required from those we choose to love? When we don't rule out certain people based on traits that they have or things that they've done, when we don't rule people out from loving them unconditionally based on some of those other things. What does pure, untainted love look like? What does serving God look like when it is stripped of all ulterior or self-serving motives? As we're getting involved in church ministry, different types of ministry, and we're doing it for God, it's so easy for other things to creep in there, like, oh, this makes me look good or feel good about my morality, or, different things like that. What does worship look like when it is solely about focusing on and serving God, rather than also looking for an experience that we hope to have in the process? What does helping others look like when it's stripped of any desire to be thought well of afterward? And those are just a few examples. And I have to confess that, thinking about those endeavors and trying to picture what they would look like in their absolute purity, and then thinking about living that out myself, sounds like fantasy to me. An awareness of potential self-serving benefits seems to always pop up in my thoughts, even when I'm trying to wholeheartedly serve God with only pure motives. But again, contemplating purity is not meant to discourage us, but rather open our minds to the beauty and character of God that our jaded hearts tend not to imagine. It really is something to realize as you contemplate the standards of God and then contemplate them with absolute purity, that like, wow, there is a being that exists that is like that. And He's not self-absorbed and a jerk about it, but He's loving and wants to share Himself with me and to experience Him in relationship with Him forever. I mean, it's really, the more you think about that, the more your view of God enlarges, the more your awareness of His patience with you enlarges, and His forgiveness, the sense of His forgiveness enlarges. And it changes your perspective on all kinds of things that you're thinking about and experiencing in life. Contemplating purity also leaves us with aspirations for how we can be more like Jesus, and raises questions about how to grow in those ways. If we're stagnant in our faith, feeling stagnant, feeling like, what is my life about? What's the purpose of my life about? When we are to be living our lives as acts of worship to God, we can discover more of our purpose by contemplating the standards of God and the purity of God. And we can then find ourselves asking questions, okay, so I've just realized that this is something I could be moving more into. There's a degree of purity I could be moving toward more. Now, how do I get there? And I think that's a wonderful thing for us to be thinking about and questioning, because those questions should then lead us into deeper relationships and community with other believers who are themselves endeavoring to, with humility, walk toward purity. And finally, contemplating purity in conjunction with God's standards gives us, as I said briefly before, a refreshed appreciation for our deep need of Christ's sacrifice and the amazing gift of forgiveness and freedom from guilt we now have. Contemplating God's standards and His purity will probably come with some tension in it. It does for me. It's like, oh my gosh, I am just so much worse off in my moral character than I thought I was. And so there's that moment of, man, that's some bad news. That's a tough pill to swallow. But then, in the same measure, comes, or should come, this recognition of, wow, and I have been forgiven of that. That burden then can be completely lifted off of me as I realize, oh my gosh, that weight on me was heavier than I even imagined, and now all of it is lifted off, by truly contemplating the forgiveness and the grace of God along with His purity and His standards. Okay, so what's in all this for geeks? Well, as a reminder, this passage in Philippians is at least partly taught within the context of Christians who are dealing with external persecution from non-believers and internal conflict with other Christians. In those situations, a healthy and maturing thought life can make a huge difference in what we feel and experience. Both of those types of situations can really lead us to feeling insecure and worried. And so our thought life is all the more important in those kinds of situations. As I've observed many times before, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, so I apologize for that, but it is very relevant to us. Insecurity. It's very common. It's a very common trait among us as geeks. It's certainly a major part of my life. And legalism, or attempts at self-righteousness and self-justification, are often a part of our insecurity. When so often we feel undervalued and unappreciated by people, we, without even realize we're doing it, construct a system of self-worth that is based on what we consider to be our already existing strengths and traits. Very convenient of us. And then we begin to find our identity, our sense of self-worth, our sense of being okay. We find all of that in those things instead of our actual identity as God's adopted royal children and representatives in the world. Those traits that we choose to value in ourselves and focus on and prioritize as being important might be particular moral strengths of ours, such as obedience and purity in certain areas of our lives, or they might be personality traits like a disposition toward really heartfelt worship or deep intellectual study of Scripture. They can also be traits related to our interest as geeks. We can think of ourselves proudly as, I'm a hardcore geek about this or this or this, and we can take pride in our knowledge or skill in our areas of geeky interest. All of these self-made value constructs may give us feelings of confidence and significance at times, but all it takes is for someone more geeky than us to come along and show their geekiness or their moral strengths, or for them to express disagreement with us, and suddenly we have to defend what is really this weak and substanceless basis of self-worth from comparison or interaction with others. God is not primarily interested in us looking like we have it all together, or seeming valuable or significant to others, or being respected by them. He wants to free us from that whole rat race and the conflict that comes with it. And that starts in large part with having an accurate picture of where God is at morally, where we are at morally, the righteous standing we have before God because of Christ, and what direction He wants us to move in to become more like Him. If you'd like some help finding a good church in your area, I would love to help you do that if I can. Online resources and communities are good supplements, but by nature they just can't speak to your particular situation like relationships in a local church can. The context for almost everything in the New Testament assumes that we're serving and building purposeful relationships in a local church. So whether you're in a church that just kind of lacks Bible-based intentionality or maybe not attending any church at all, if I can help you get connected to an authentic, compassionate, Bible-oriented church, I want to do that. You can email me at paeter@spiritblade.com, and we can look at some websites of churches in your area together.